Episode 6 starts off right where episode 5 left off, with George barging in the house, demanding to know where Leanne is. Julian gets in his way from going up the steps, and Dorothy tells him, if you want Leanne back, we need Jericho back. We explain all this to you in the car. Tensions are running high, and Sean can sense it, so he pulls George to the side to have a more civil conversation. While he's doing that, Julian does inform Sean that it was Leanne who sent the ransom note just to screw with them. Sean doesn't really care about that, though. He sits George down and says, we had a deal. Jericho would stay with us. But George says, that deal wasn't with me. George all of a sudden can smell something rotting and says it. And both Julian and Sean say, yeah, it's the pipes. We're getting them switched out. And George says aloud, of course, it's the house. He then starts making his way downstairs where he finds the hole that Leanne was buried in, although he doesn't know that. George tells both Julian and Sean that Leanne had caused this, the foundation crumbling, the burst pipes. But both Sean and Julian say, no, they were old pipes. They probably should have been replaced a while ago. George then starts to make his way back upstairs, but in the doorway is Dorothy. He asks Dorothy, how long has Leanne been here? And they say, about a week? And George gets so upset about hearing that, asking him, you kept her here all this time? George runs past Dorothy and finds the nearest window and immediately starts praying for the Turners, telling God they didn't know what they were doing. And while he's doing it, Dorothy is screaming at him, I don't need to be prayed for. I didn't do anything wrong. But George isn't even listening to her, turning to her and saying it might not be too late to fix this, and continuing to head upstairs. It's worth noting, though, as soon as he's done praying, it really starts to rain. George runs upstairs looking for Leanne in her room but doesn't find her, and at this point, Julian's sick of George, so he's ready to throw down. But George kind of looks at him like, I'm not going to fight. What I want to know, though, is why aren't you frightened of her? Of all she's done. I mean, that baby never should have been here. It was a mistake. Leanne needs to be returned to the house that you guys took her from. And Sean walks in the room, breaking up the conversation, sending Julian down the hall, telling him that Dorothy needs him. And really, the only thing that Dorothy needs him for is to vent about the fact that George keeps bringing up Leanne needs to be returned to the Westchester house. Sean really just wanted to have a private conversation with George. George asks Sean, what did you guys do? And Sean tells him, we needed help, and we thought she was the only one we could turn to. And George is kind of aghast and says, so you took her? You've got to return her. But Sean doesn't understand why it's so important Leanne goes back. So he tells George, explain this to me. What's so important about that house? So George sits down and tells Sean that Leanne has always had a rebellious streak ever since she was a child. She would often stray from the communal edicts. Sean cuts him off asking, what community you're talking about? And George tells him, you know who we are. You just choose not to. We're all amongst you, although we try not to take up space. You might see us on a street corner or under an overpass. We are the ones who have been given a second chance at life, and we use it to enact God's divine plan. We use it to help others, but we can only help the people that we are told to help. And Leanne disobeys that. So when Leanne brought Jericho here, and even coming here in the first place, that wasn't Leanne's call to make. She shouldn't have done it. That's the whole reason why Jericho couldn't stay. George also points out that Leanne meddled further and points at Sean's injured hand. George tells Sean his only hope is to take Leanne back to where she's needed. After that, pray for forgiveness. And the forgiveness that Sean will be praying for is the fact that when he got the call about going out to Los Angeles for that cooking show, initially he said he couldn't do it because they had a newborn. But when they called back, he thought, I might want a vacation. Jericho had colic, and both him and Dorothy weren't sleeping much, so he decided to take the call and go out to Los Angeles. It eventually led to Jericho's death. George looks at Sean and says, if you return her and you make things right, I'll undo what she did. I'll heal you. And that's how you'll be reunited with him. Although we don't know if he's talking about Jericho or God. Now in the attic, Leanne is hearing all of this because George and Sean are having this conversation right underneath her. And when she hears Uncle George say that, she kind of panics. George and Sean walk out of the room with George heading all the way down to the basement to make Sean an ointment for his injured hand. And Dorothy starts hounding Sean for details, but Sean tells her all George wants is Leanne back. Dorothy figures that George isn't in control. They need to get in touch with Aunt May, but that's going to be an issue because George doesn't have a cell phone. After this friendly reminder from Sean, Dorothy continues to grill Sean about what him and George were talking about in the other room. And Sean sheepishly admits that they were talking about returning Leanne back to that house in Westchester. Dorothy gets really upset at this because she's just sick of hearing that. And then Sean mentions how George talked about divine repercussions. And Dorothy is totally taken aback by this because it sounds ridiculous. Locusts, plagues, boils. And Sean knows it sounds ridiculous, but he's also kind of buying into it because he was the one that was dealing with splinters coming out of his throat. Sean brings up the fact that everything in the cellar started happening the day after they brought her back. But the more Sean talks, the more Dorothy's thinking that Sean's gone crazy. So just to get away, Dorothy walks downstairs, and Sean realizes he should probably talk to Leanne. So he heads upstairs in the attic, and Leanne asks him, "What did my uncle say about me?" And Sean tells her, "Your uncle said you need to be returned to the family in Westchester." Sean then asks Leanne, "Did you disobey your aunt and uncle by coming here?" And she admits that she did. Sean tells her, "You came here to help us, and we need your help now." But Leanne turns to him and says, "I already told you. I don't think Jericho can come back here." But Sean is optimistic, telling Leanne, "I think he can come back. I think we can fix this." And Sean's devised a plan. When he heads downstairs from the attic, he tells Julian, "You're going to help me take Leanne back to that house in Westchester. You're going to pose a distraction to Dorothy. We're not going to tell her. We're just going to do it." And Dorothy isn't privy to this conversation because Dorothy headed downstairs in the basement where George was making that ointment, and she brought him the bag of money. And initially, George picks it up, and Dorothy thinks, all right, he's taking the money. But he walks over to the hole that Leanne was buried in and just dumps it in there. To which Dorothy starts screaming at him about how he took Jericho, but George is focused on a large strand of Leanne's hair that he found in the hole. He shows it to Dorothy and says, "She was down here?" And Dorothy, who doesn't want to tell George the actual truth, just says, yeah, I guess. George says aloud that Leanne's presence in the house is an infection that's spreading. He gets on his knees and starts to pray for Dorothy and the house and Leanne and asks Dorothy to do it with him, but she says no. Dorothy starts yelling at George, and when Julian comes downstairs, he sees that George is kind of close to Dorothy, and he throws him back, thinking that George is attacking his sister. He then notices all the cash in the hole and starts grabbing at it, and George chides him for being focused on the money. But all of this is going on downstairs because upstairs, Sean is trying to execute his escape plan. But before him and Leanne leave, Leanne says, "I'll go with you, but just promise me, you won't take me back to that house in Westchester. You take me far away so that they can't ever find me. Because my uncle is lying. He's never going to bring Jericho back here." Sean promises, but Leanne can tell that he's lying. And as he promises once again, and it seems like they're about to leave the house, they overhear the news on the TV say that there were gunshots at the house in Westchester that they're heading to. So Leanne and Sean are just dead in their tracks watching the news coverage. Now in the basement, George turns to Dorothy and says, if Leanne doesn't leave this house, but Dorothy just cuts him off and says, "Nothing matters unless I have Jericho." George tells her, "You need to own the part that you play in all of this." But Dorothy starts to defend herself, saying, "I didn't do anything to Leanne that she didn't deserve. And if Sean hadn't come down here, I would have left her in there." At that moment, Dorothy realized that she messed up. She accidentally admitted that the hole was for Leanne. And when George realizes it, he screams at her, "You're never going to get Jericho back now." The two start screaming at each other, but they're distracted when cockroaches start crawling out of that hole. And I'm talking a lot of cockroaches. Enough to have Dorothy and Julian flee upstairs. And when they get upstairs, they see the same news coverage that Leanne and Sean see, and they're also frozen. And eventually, Uncle George makes his way upstairs, and when he sees the news coverage, he angrily yells, "Look what you have done," as Leanne is frozen still, mortified. Thanks for checking this recap out. Consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video if you liked it. Hit thumbs down if you didn't. If you don't see the next episode in one of the end screens, not to worry, it'll be up shortly. Be nice in the comments section. If you heard a mistake, hey, mistakes happen. You don't have to point it out. You can just keep it moving. And check out my guys over at Scene Invaders. They're reacting live to each episode of Servant. It's not a recap. It's just their reaction to the episode. It's really good stuff. Check them out as well.